Hello everyone, and welcome back to another special episode of Spooky AF. My name is Rob, and today I'm joined by my co-host Suz. Suz, how are you?
I'm alright. I am so glad to be heading into the depths of spooky season.
Oh god, same here. It's been really fun this year actually for some reason. I don't know why, it just feels different. I think last year there was just this non-spooky feeling, even though we launched the podcast and everything. Well, it kind of just blitzed past me. To be fair,
this year, we finally did get out in the field this year.
That is true. That is true.
We took it up a notch.
Yep, and that is actually going to be our Halloween special as well, so people can tune in on the 31st and listen to our on-site investigation, which was so fun.
I mean, and I also wanted to let you know that my husband has finally, after almost 7 years of marriage, has agreed to basically watch some of my favorite horror films with me.
That is fantastic.
So we watched some that I just thought maybe he'd like that I hadn't seen in a while. So we watched VHS recently.
Yeah, so good.
So good. Like, I had forgotten how creepy it is. But, I just thought I would update you because as the listeners know, our spouses are not really into horror.
Oh, yeah. And as little as your husband is into horror, my wife is just, it's a no-go. It's a no for her. She's just like, nah, I'm good, thanks very much. This is a woman who, when we watched Zodiac, I think it was 2 years ago or something, she didn't sleep for a night or two because she was like, the serial killer from the 60s is probably just waiting outside for me.
I got my husband to watch Event Horizon.
Yeah, no, it just would not happen with her.
and he liked it. So I was I'm winning.
People need to just sit down and fucking, what is it they say in Zombieland? Nut up or shut up.
Put your big girl britches on.
Yeah. And just watch some horror, and you will be surprised with how much you enjoy it.
Exactly.
That's all I'm saying. It's not a controversial take.
So, Rob, what are we doing for this special episode?
So, in case people haven't noticed, we have been doing some slightly different things for the month of October. It's obviously, spooky season, as we've just said, but it's also the anniversary month for the podcast. So with that in mind, we've just done some different things this month. So you'll notice that there's been no kind of short episodes. That was intentional. That's not a mistake on my behalf, in case anyone was wondering. We had our joint episode with the Beer Ladies podcast, which was amazing. We both had so much fun with that. And as we said, we have an on-site investigation as well. So to wrap up our trilogy of special episodes, basically, we have decided that we are going to present some scary short stories that were sent in to us by a listener. And this is something that's completely different, that we've not done this before. So I know with the short episodes, I do kind of write a little bit more and I read some intros, kind of like prose sort of things. This is basically what I was aiming to do with it, but actually good. So that's basically what it is. So a listener got in touch with us from Into the Shadows.
Oh my god, I am really looking into getting some wall art from this. I think he identifies as a man. So yes, it's so good. It's so good. It is
so good. I can't emphasize enough.
Well, it's both beautiful and horrific. I think, they are hauntingly elegant but also just really tapping into some kind of primordial shadow fears, like the way he plays with the light and dark in his drawings.
Yeah,
really
it gives
great.
off this real kind of. So these are they're like ink drawings is how they look, but it's all generally in black and white. There's a few bits with color in it, but for the most part they're black and white. And to me they give off this kind of eldritch terror sort of vibe. I just love it so much. They're just so cool. Big fan. I'm loving them. Yeah, they just give off this super cool vibe. I think they're amazing. And we'll link their account and everything in the description afterwards, so people can please go view them.
Yeah, they're so good. And so, the short stories that they sent us, it's actually interesting because usually you get illustrations to go along with a narrative, but this seems almost like the opposite. They're just little snippets of they're very short, kind of picaresques, and they accompany the art. They're really kind of making the art a bit fuller, which I think is really interesting.
Totally, I completely agree. Like, these stories basically have been built around the art. That's what it kind of feels like. And like the art is phenomenal. So we'll have 1 or 2 pictures. We've gotten permission. We'll put 1 or 2 pictures in with the social media posts that we put up as well, so you can see just a snippet of what we're talking about. And they're actually the pictures that are relevant to the stories that we're talking about today. So we will both be presenting a story where we're going to read out the short story to you all, just to give you an idea of what's in this amazing book that they've just published recently. And yeah, you can kind of go from there and look into it yourselves. I would strongly recommend people to look into them more. They are really, really good stories, and the art is amazing. And you're also just supporting someone who's very, very passionate about what they do.
Yeah, I was reading through them and just really enjoying, because like they are short, and so they are almost like a horror snapshot, which is really fun. And I think that they cover a lot of different interesting things like urban legends and cryptids and things. Yeah. And then there's also just some general like classic spookiness to them. But also I have to give, like, I'm not doing this particular story, but an honorable mention to, there are some incredibly horrific drawings of bats.
Yeah,
like
there
evil,
are.
like demon bats. And it really is, if you've ever seen Cabin in the Woods, there's like a giant bat at the end.
Yeah.
That, like, as one of the monsters that's attacking, and it looks like a shadow version of that, and it's honestly terrifying. And
it really
I love
does,
bats.
actually. Yeah, they are phenomenal. There's an amazing picture as well of a werewolf in it. That
and
so cool.
There's just another one that is very, like, it's almost reminiscent of, if you've ever seen the Hush episode of Buffy. It won an Emmy. It's the one where they can't speak for the episode, but it's The Gentleman. Like, there's kind of a one that's kind of riffing off that. That's also very.
You know what's really funny? You're actually the second person to say that to me this week. Already,
up.
And we're recording on a Monday. You're the second person to say that to me.
Amazing. Yeah. You surround yourself with Buffy enthusiasts. You really do.
I didn't even. It actually, the reference came from someone that I wasn't even expecting it from, so that was even better. So, yeah, bonus points there. But yeah, with that said, I today am going to be recording a story called The Oily Spot, which, when I was reading through it just gave me some serious vibes of, like, The Thing. Really kind of tickled that sort of part of my brain. So I will be definitely looking forward to recording that. And yeah, I can't wait to hear the response from people that listen to it as well. What are you going to be recording today, Suz?
Well, as a bit of a callback to one of our first episodes, he has a story on La Llorona.
Amazing.
So I will be reading. It's just a short snapshot of La Llorona that I will be reading for you guys.
I cannot wait for that. I love the lore that's built around La Llorona.
Well, because I remember in the episode we really went into like the history and like things that drew off of and kind of issues with it and opportunities with it in terms of representation and all that. And then now we just get to like settle into some spooky vibes with it, which I'm all about.
Totally. I couldn't agree more. It's such a cool story. I'm a big fan of it. And yeah, it'll be nice to revisit. Not just actually one of our...
I mean, it's just echoing my childhood nightmares.
Yeah, true. Yeah, but it's fun. It's fun to revisit one of the earlier episodes, and it's not the first episode that we're revisiting as well. That might be something to do with our on-site next week, maybe. But yeah, with that said, I hope you all enjoy, and you can let us know what you think afterwards. So this is The Oily Spot, and as I said, it gives me serious John Carpenter's The Thing vibes. Mac Hammer stared at the pine trees surrounding his site. Even though he was a rough and tough lifetime oil rigger, the greenery of the forest was a nice change from the empty plains that had been drilled recently. He was standing on top of his mixing tanks, watching dirt material from deep down their drill hole come across his shifting screens and taking samples every few minutes. They were far up north here at Wolf Lake. They were drilling some exploratory wells for the company, and it truly was the middle of nowhere. The trees went on for thousands of acres around their site, the deep green stretching out as far as his eyes could see. He thought to himself that he was one of the few people to ever see this site, and that once they were gone, it would likely be hundreds of years before anyone else was back up here. Unless they found something valuable in the earth below, that was. His thoughts were interrupted by his equipment. Suddenly, among the dirt and material, he saw something oily come across his filter screens. It was unlike the other oil or tar he would sometimes see, and they weren't expecting to hit any oil here. The area wasn't suitable for it. He took off his glove and touched it, rubbing it between his fingers. It was weird. It felt smooth like no oil he had ever felt, and it made his fingers tingle. It was also clear and seemed to shimmer. As he watched, it faded down into the screens and into the fluid mix underneath it. He had no idea what that could have been. Confused, he radioed in the geologist to come over and see him. Mac told him what he had seen, and the geologist confirmed they shouldn't be hitting any oil or tar sands, but said that's why they were drilling exploratory holes. So unsure of what it could have been, the two men tried to find some of the substance for testing, but there were no sign of the oily shimmering fluid, just a warm tingle on his fingers where he had touched it. Unable to find any trace of it, the geologist left and told Mac to grab a sample next time he sees it, either in the tank or coming across the screens. Mac settled back into his routine, lighting up a smoke and watching the screens as they drilled down miles into the earth. By the time he'd finished his smoke, his fingers had started to sting a little. He looked down at them, and seeing that they were a little red where he had touched the oily substance, he went and scrubbed them. The scrubbing didn't seem to help, and the pain slowly increased. Cursing about his now peeling, burning fingers, Mac went to see the medic. He described the situation to her, and not knowing what it could be, she gave him some cream for caustic chemical burns. The burning sensation was better almost immediately, and she bandaged up his hand for him. Relieved, Mac went back to work, keeping an eye out for that oily substance. He was more unsure than ever about what it was now, but he did know that he wasn't going to touch it again. He never had anything from a hole do that to him. His hands were tough, hard, thick-skinned from a lifetime of labour and handling chemicals. This stuff had chewed through his skin in less than an hour. For the next 8 hours or so, he watched, and every now and then, he thought he saw small dollar coin-sized bits come through the screens, but they always sank through the screens into the tank below before he could grab a sample. The clear liquid had already been hard enough to see amid all the other fluids and materials, let alone small amounts like these. He walked back and forth across the tanks, looking down through the metal grates that served as a floor. His footsteps rattled them in their places as his heavy frame passed over the tanks. He was looking for any sign of the shiny oil, but looking down into them, the fluids in his tank looked normal. He'd gotten to the far side of the tank and was just about to head back over when he saw it, a large patch of clear fluid inside his tank. All the little pieces he'd seen come across his screens must have joined together into one large mass. It was about 5 feet long by 2 feet wide and oval shaped, at least a couple of inches thick from what he could see. It was definitely the stuff from earlier. It had that same shimmering appearance. As Max stood over it looking down, he couldn't think of anything like he'd seen before. He decided he would go get the geologist. He turned and started to walk away, his footsteps clanging the grates around, when suddenly the clanging stopped. Max stopped also. He'd worked here for years and he'd never heard it not clang around before. It was so strange that it gave him pause. He took another couple of steps, quiet also. The grate he was on wasn't rattling around loosely in their frames as they normally would. He turned in curiosity to look around the tank to see what was different, and he almost fell over in shock, grabbing at the railing near him and squeezing it in horror and disbelief. The oily substance had raised itself up out of the fluid of the tank, a large blob half passing through the grate and stretching out in long fingers up into the cold night air. It was large but clear, and Mac could see the green trees behind it, distorted by the oily mass now before him. That was enough for Mac. He turned and bolted off the tank. His feet never even touched the stairs as he ran down off the tank. He ran to the geologist's trailer, not for any particular reason, but almost as in reflex. The last place his mind had consciously wanted to go was the geo's trailer, and in his fear, that was where his body went. By the time he got there, he was out of breath and barely jogging. As he got closer to the trailer, he saw the geologist come outside to greet him, and for the first time he had to think about what he was going to say. The geologist had seen him come across the site and assumed Mac had a sample for him. "Did you see any more of that stuff?" the geologist asked. Mac stood there for a moment, his brain trying to work out this situation. He had certainly seen it, but what he had seen had defied all reason. He couldn't tell this man the truth. It sounded crazy. It was crazy. The geologist would surely tell the rest of the crews, and Mac would be a laughingstock. He couldn't tell the geologist anything. "No," he forced out the words, trying to sound natural amid his heaving breaths. "Nothing. I didn't see anything." The geologist was confused at why Mac had run over to the trailer just to tell him that, but people acting strange wasn't unusual out here. He didn't want to stand outside in the cold for no reason. "Well, keep an eye out for them in the tanks. I'd really like a sample," he said and turned, hopping back up into his trailer and leaving Mac outside, trying to catch his breath and thoughts. Screw the tanks, screw the sampling, he thought to himself. There was no way he was going back up there today. There was only a couple more hours left on his shift till they changed over with the night shift crew. He knew how to work the system and planned to spend the rest of the shift looking busy and avoiding the tanks, but he could not avoid the oily mass. A short time later, he was in the mixing room, cutting open large chemical bags and dumping them into the hopper when he spotted it, a shimmer in the corner of his eye. His head snapped to the side, and he stared at it. There it was, the oily patch from the mixing tanks, but now it was on the wall of the mixing room to his left. Horrified, he jumped backwards off his stool, knocking it to the floor and spilling his bag all over. Without taking his eyes off the thing on the wall, he sidestepped to the door. It was hard to see because it was clear, but the shimmer gave it away. It was spread all over the wall like a stain the size of a man, and as he watched, it seemed to ripple, and then it was stretching out away from the wall in tendrils, the arms elongating and reaching towards Mac. Mac bolted the last few steps out of the small room, and once a few meters outside, he turned, looked through the doorway of the mixing shack as he stood in the cold air. He watched as the tendrils retracted back into the oily mass and it flattened back against the wall. Luckily, the door to the mixing room swung outwards, and Mac slammed it shut with a crash. That was enough for him. He'd stay outside for the rest of the shift. He was almost done, almost headed back to camp. Whatever that thing was, it was night shift's problem now, and he wanted nothing to do with these terrifying events. A short time later, he saw the lights of the crew truck shine through the now darkened trees, and he knew his nightmare was almost over. He did the fastest shift handover he had ever done, completely avoiding all mention of the oily patch to his night shift counterpart. Mac was the first onto the crew truck, and as he sat there, he saw the other crew start to go about their shift, and watched as his counterpart opened up the door to the mixing shack and went inside, shutting the door behind him. Mac held his breath, staring at the closed door as his other crew members got into the truck. But no one ran out in terror. The door to the mixing shack remained shut as the last of his crew got in. The truck started its long drive through the woods back to camp. Back at camp, he may have avoided the oily mass, but he couldn't avoid his thoughts. He was on edge, staring at corners and surfaces, unable to rest. He'd barely touched his dinner, leaving the rest of the guys in the mess hall as he headed back to his room. He was still reeling from the events of the day and was mentally and emotionally exhausted. He opened the door to his shared room and lay down on his bed, staring up at the ceiling. Suddenly, to his horror, he saw it in his room, a shimmering on the wall next to his bed. He rolled out of bed and crashed to the floor. As he bounded up, he saw the oily shimmer stretching its arms out at the wall from the wall towards him. He recoiled in fear, almost falling backwards. He turned, and with one big stride, he was at the door to the little room, and he burst through into the hallway, slamming it shut behind him. He stood in the hallway with his back against the opposite wall, staring at the door to his room, trying to figure out what had just happened. He saw his roommate come into the hallway and start walking towards Mac and their room. His mind raced, but he didn't know what to say to his roommate. He couldn't tell him there was a shimmering, oily mass in there trying to grab him. He could only stand there as the other man walked up, told Mac he was heading to bed, and to be quiet coming in later. He opened the door and strolled into the room. As the door shut, Mac was still standing there silent, frozen with confusion and indecision. As the seconds dragged on, he decided to at least get out of the hallway. There was no noise from inside the room. Maybe he was losing his marbles, he thought to himself, but no. He looked down at his bandaged fingers that were still aching and burning. The shimmer was real, and it had followed him back to the camp somehow. Mac decided the best course of action was to go to the commons room. It was well lit, had comfortable couches. It was also far enough away from his room to put his mind at ease, but only so much. He couldn't focus on anything on the TV, and he kept looking at the walls, looking for that shimmer. What was it? How did it follow him? Did it travel through walls? And what was it? He stayed in there all night, his brain and heart racing, too much for sleep to be possible. In the morning, he went back to his room to get his toothbrush and clothes for the day's shift. He hesitated at the door, hand hovering above the knob. Then he pushed it down the feeling of fear, turned the knob, and went inside. There was no sign of his roommate, no sign of the oily sheen that had been on the wall next to his bed. The room seemed normal, nothing out of the ordinary. His roommate wasn't there, but he was probably up early at the mess hall, eating like usual. Mac quickly grabbed his stuff and headed off to the bathroom to change. It seemed like it took ages for him to get ready. Between the lack of sleep and looking over his shoulder constantly, by the time he'd finished washing, it was almost time to get into the crew truck. As he hurried to the truck, he passed the kitchen, but even the delicious smells drifting into the hallway didn't make him stop. He had no appetite. Food was the last thing on his mind. He hopped into the truck to the usual morning chatter, how cold it was supposed to be that day, how the breakfast was, what supper was supposed to be. The driver started to pull away and Mac noticed his roommate wasn't in the truck. He told the driver to hold up. They're short a guy. The driver and a couple of the crew laughed. They told him they hadn't seen Mac's roommate all morning, and that the other day he'd been telling them about some girl he wanted to shack up with. They all assumed he'd met up with her last night and ignored his alarm this morning. He was known to pull stunts like this, and the fellas were used to him showing up late the next morning with coffees and stories to tell. But as the truck pulled out of the camp and headed up the trails to their site, Mac felt something was very wrong. As the morning went on, Mac kept looking for the shimmer everywhere he went. He also kept an eye out for his roommate's truck, but neither ever appeared. As it turned to noon, and then afternoon, the crew had turned from amused to annoyed. It was not uncommon for riggers to go on a bender and disappear, or to just not show up for shift and never be back. The crew assumed it was one of those two options, all but Mac. Mac knew about the shimmer, how it had been in the room. Mac thought it had to be related. When they finished their shift and had made it back to camp, a couple of the crew asked Mac if they could come into his room to see if his roommate's stuff was gone like they expected. But when they entered the room, all his stuff was still there, nothing missing. His truck was still parked outside. This made the crew think that he was probably on a bender somewhere, and he would just show back up soon enough. But it made Mac terrified to his core. His roommate had told him he was going to sleep. This man was not out partying. The man was... Mac tried to think of what could have happened, but he couldn't. The two men from his crew left the room, shutting the door behind him. As the door clicked shut, Mac noticed it. He felt his body tighten and his breath squeezed out of him. His mind froze, too horrified to process it. There, only feet away from him, was the oily sheen. It was on the back of the door, bigger now, and it was blocking his only exit. He saw it start to ripple and extend outwards, reaching long arms like tentacles of liquid glass out towards him. Terrified out of his mind, Mac turned and ran towards the one window in the room. He leapt into it, the weight of the large man smashing through glass and frame, tumbling altogether to the ground 1 story below. When Detective Ripley arrived at the scene to investigate an apparent suicide, he wasn't sure what to make of it. While suicide in isolated camps wasn't unheard of, most people opened windows before they jumped. The circumstances seemed very strange, but the victim's co-workers said he had seemed very off the last few days and had been acting erratically around 2 people moments before he apparently jumped. As he looked at the broken frame where the window used to be, he stared down at the body under the tarp. Strange or not, it seemed like a clear-cut case. He turned and started to walk out of the room when he spotted a weird oily shimmer on the wall. He took off his glove and touched it, rubbing it between his fingers. It was weird. It felt smooth like no oil he'd ever felt, and it made his fingers tingle.
This is La Llorona by Into the Shadows. Ricardo was heading home after his late shift, headed up the sloped path next to the river. He walked, passing by on one side an old service station, with its pumps long shackled shut, while the moon shone pale silver off the water to his other, an abstract painting of ripples, shadows, and moonlight. The dark, night and loneliness of the road didn't bother him much. Now into his early 20s, he had grown up in this area of Durango, Mexico, lived there his whole life, and he knew how to avoid those people who were of most danger to him on the desolate roads. He eventually got to the crest of the slope, and the ground leveled out in front of him. As he looked into the distance, he saw a figure, far down the roadway. He can barely make it out in the dark, and probably wouldn't even have noticed them at all if it weren't for the bright, clear night, and the clothes they were wearing. He sees the moonlight reflect off of white fabric, a flash of bright in the dark blackness far up ahead. He continued down the road and sees the figure coming towards him, catching a glimpse every so often as the branches of the trees opened up, allowing the moonlight to glint off the white clothes of the figure. He went on unalarmed until he suddenly heard something, a sound from on down the road. It was a low wail drifting through the still night air. Ricardo paused and listened. It was definitely a woman, and very upset from the sounds of it. The sound traveled far down to him, little more than a distant wail by the time it reached him, but now he could just hear it over the crunch of gravel as he walked. He kept on down the road, with little other choice than to go forward. He would cross paths with the woman eventually, and though he had no idea what was bothering the woman, he felt it must be something very bad. He would certainly have to ask her what was wrong. She might, in fact, be in need of help. Out here, in the middle of the night, making such sounds of despair, it could only be something very bad. He continued down the road, alert now and no longer tired from the long day. His concern for the woman started to fade, though, as the wails grew louder, and the woman in the distance drew closer. His concern faded as it was replaced by fear. The wails now put the hairs up on the back of his neck, and Ricardo felt goosebumps ripple over his skin. From the back of his mind came rushing long-forgotten stories of his youth, and a childhood fear became all too real for the young man. The wails now sounded ominous and menacing, somehow, and in the spaces of moonlit road between the shadows of the trees, Ricardo could see the shape of the figure better. It was a tall figure, too tall, wrapped in a tattered, dirty white shawl. It had a strange movement, even from a distance, never bouncing in its gait or leaning, almost floating along as it echoed its wail through the air. Ricardo felt the cold fear strike him, and felt his feet anchored to the ground as adrenaline overloaded his system. He was no boy anymore, and he was not a fearful or superstitious young man. But everything in Ricardo's being told him to run right now from the figure in the street. This had to be the evil spirit of La Llorona. He did not want to cross paths with her. He did not even want to get one step closer to her. He turned and ran back down the road, in full panic now, using his adrenaline to push his body faster than he knew it could even go. But the wails grew louder in his ears. He didn't turn his head to look, but he could imagine it just as well. La Llorona speeding after him in that terrifying floating way she moved. He pushed his body harder, his legs pounding the ground as the wails grew louder still, and he flew over the crest of the hill like a long jump, landing and continuing to run even as he felt his tired body start to lag, and the wails grew in his ears. He saw the service station just to his side, and he raced to it, praying that the doors to the building weren't padlocked like the pumps out front. He would have crashed through the door, but the handle unexpectedly turned freely, and the door flung inward. Unprepared for the ease that it opened with, he tumbled in through the doorway, landing hard on the floor. He rolled. On his back and thinking quickly, he kicked the door shut and it swung closed again, the door handle latching in the frame. He scampered on his bottom to the door, putting his back against it and holding his breath as the wailing grew louder. It seemed to fill the small room that was the abandoned service station, bouncing off the walls and creating a deafening crescendo. He stayed motionless save for his slight shakes from fear, and as quickly as it had grown to roar, the wailing rescinded to a din, and then faded to a faraway wail again, as La Llorona continued to tear down the road, chasing after the young man. But he had escaped. At least it seemed that way for now. He sat there the rest of the night, freezing, but too afraid to leave the limited safety of his service station refuge. The sun was well up in the morning, and he had heard a couple people pass by before he finally felt safe enough to leave. He went to his home as fast as he could, traveling only when someone else was on the road with him, never again to forget the horror of La Llorona.
So yeah, they were our two stories that we've recorded, The Oily Spot and La Llorona. I know I really, really enjoyed recording my story. It gave me such a just creepy vibe, and it's just the perfect precursor to the end of the spooky season. How about you, Suz? What did you think of your story?
Well, on the one hand, it was really fun to kind of do a story, finally kind of read a narrative, which I haven't done on the podcast before, but it was also really scratching that itch inside me that was, the child in class who really wanted to be chosen to read aloud every time. Oh
my God, you absolutely were that child.
Oh yeah. So it was both spooky and really gratifying to me. It felt cathartic.
So the podcast has now become an audiobook going forward. This is Suz's Scary Tales. And
Suz will just read things that she enjoys, and you will have to listen.
Look, we have enough people that are like Suz stands basically at this point that they would listen to basically anything that you put out. So,
Oh my God. No. Oh, I love those poor wayward people.
What have we done to them?
What have we done? Oh God, no! But this was so much fun, and hopefully we can do more stuff like this in the future. So yeah, if you have creative spooky endeavors, or of things that would be kind of open access and like us give them permission to read aloud, I think we could sprinkle these in every now and again. I think it'd be really fun.
100%. I'd love to do more of this. It's really cool to, well, as we said at the start, to promote someone in the community as well. It's really cool, but it's also just something very different to what we do. And it's good to have a bit of variety out there as well. It's changes it up, gives someone something that they like, and we won't do too many of them, but it would be fun, as you said, to kind of sprinkle them in every now and then.
All right, Rob, where can all our spooky friends find us?
You can find us on Instagram at the SpookyAFPod. You can get us at Gmail at the SpookyAFPodcast@gmail.com. We're also on Threads with the SpookyAFPod. We're also on YouTube as well at the SpookyAF Podcast. So we're kind of everywhere, really, at the moment. We are not using Twitter and won't be, so sorry to anyone that has strong feelings about that.
Yeah, we're kind of crawling under the floorboards of all the social medias, and if you know where to find us, we are
absolutely
active.
We're just kind of like lurking in the background, like Joaquin Phoenix in Signs. We're just in the closet, just lurking there
with our tinfoil hats on.
Move, little children, vámonos.
We're just yelling at the screen
Exactly.
of a small VCR.
I mean, to be fair, we
TV.
basically just shout into the void anyway, so it's pretty
Oh,
accurate.
100%.
But more importantly, I will link the important stuff in the description today for Into the Shadows. Please go follow them on Instagram, look on their Etsy page, consider ordering the book. It is a really, really good read. I cannot recommend it enough. And I think that's a perfect way to close out the episode. So, if you enjoyed listening to this, if you want to reach out to us, please do. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. We'd love to get some of your listener submissions as well if you want us to read out more of this in the future. And with that, I hope you have a lovely rest of the day whenever it is that you're listening to this, and we'll catch you in the next one. Take it easy, guys.
Bye, y'all.